Hey all, and welcome back to another episode of There's Danger Here. I'm Leilani, and I'm going to be doing another inmate-driven episode, though it does cut off, and I'll explain why kind of when we get there. The first part of this is directly from letters received. Quisi Bryan was born on October 2nd, 1970 to parents Cassandra Bryan and Louis McCoy in Boston, Massachusetts. Bryan says that his parents were both in the Black Panther Party in the 60s and 70s, and that's how they met. While Cassandra believed it was exclusive, Louis did not. He had another woman and soon wed her. The two quickly went on to have another daughter, Bryan's half-sister, Kalia, with whom Bryan remains close to. All right, so we're going to get into his letters, so it's going to be in the first person. When I was 6 or 7 years old and wanted to play sports with my friends, my mother wanted me to be back in the house once the street lights came on. But I loved hanging out with my friends, and my mother would always have to come out and look for me, or she'd stick her head out the window and scream my name, letting me know it's past time. I was my mother's only child. However, she had a son 2 years before me, before I was born, that was murdered by someone my mother trusted to watch him. She had named him Alexander. That happened when she lived in Philly. My mother took me to church and had me baptized in those younger years, and I attended private school up until 6th or 7th grade. And because I was in the same private school since kindergarten, I knew all the teachers and students, and they knew me. I had been sent to the principal's office for more than a few times for having a smart mouth. My principal was the pastor of the church as well. St. Francis de Sales was a Catholic private school run by nuns, though our teachers were mostly not nuns and our principal was actually Baptist. But right across the street was this Catholic church, and we would attend Mass there, as well as every Catholic holiday at the church, sometimes even during school hours. I was an average student who didn't apply himself. Math was my most difficult subject, and my mother was always easily frustrated trying to tutor me. I had a small circle of friends, so I wasn't the popular kid. I never had a problem with girls, though. I always had girls I talked on the phone with when such things as, quote, call waiting, end quote, existed. So my mother always yelled at me to get off the line so she could receive the calls she was expecting. I stole a lot of shit. Not from stores, but from my mother's friends. I did steal my very first gun from my father when my mother sent me on a plane to visit him all by myself at 9 years old. His wife did not know that he had a son, and my sister reminded me that during those years our father was an active alcoholic. Out of the 5 kids that he had, our youngest sister, by his wife, was the only child that he raised. At 12 years old, I was arrested for a crime I did not commit and held in a maximum security juvenile detention center in a rural area of Boston called Mallory's, Mass. I spent almost 2 years there, and this was my first exposure to incarceration. A woman who had been on a train with me, whom I did not know at the time, was listening to a conversation I was having with some friends I was with. We got off the train to see another one of our friends who worked as a cashier at Wendy's. We were hungry and wanted to eat. We get there, get the food, and on our way out the door, I see police getting out of a car and approaching our group, with an older woman running beside them, pointing out, saying, quote, that's him, that's the one who shot my daughter, end quote. I'm looking around, not exactly knowing who she's pointing at, until the police grab me, turn me around, and put me in handcuffs. Then I knew for sure she was talking about me, but I still felt as soon as she realized she was pointing at the wrong guy, they would uncuff me and let me go because I had no idea who she was or what she was talking about. When they put me inside of the patrol car and took me to the precinct and locked me up in a cage alone, I still had hope that this would be worked out in the next couple of hours. Those expected couple hours turned into a 2-year fight to be released. This woman, I learned, had called the police on me, saying that while riding the train, she said she had heard me say to my friends that I had robbed and ended up shooting some chick because she tried to fight. The woman who had been robbed and shot the night before was her daughter and believed at the moment that she heard these kids on the train talking about robbing and shooting her daughter, specifically me. She followed us to Wendy's and then called the police. I spent 6 years with the Department of Youth Services, in and out of detention, backups, and halfway houses. It was called the DUIs back then. Before the age of 13, I drank and smoked weed regularly, and had also been given cocaine. I had tried black beauties and speed. This was before the age of 13 because of my size. I looked older than I was, and I hung out with much older kids and grown men. The men I called quote unquote friends with were pimps, players, which is a little different than pimps, prostitutes, thieves of all types, and robbers, armed and strong armed robbers as well, grifters who could con people out of their cash. I hung out with all these types of people. My mother was the exact opposite of these types. My mother was raised and born outside of the country in France and Panama because her father was a career military man, and that's where he spent many years in those countries where he was stationed with my mother and her 10 brothers and sisters. I almost spent 2 years at the Supermax Detention Center for juveniles while fighting for a bogus case against me for a robbery and shooting of this woman's daughter, which was one of the worst things that could have happened to me as a young teen. I had to prove my innocence, and fortunately for me, was able to do just that. After my acquittal, I went to my mother's, but she kicked me out after about 48 hours because I broke into the vacant apartment downstairs after returning home. Thinking back that all these years ago still causes me pain at 54 years old. My very first escape attempt happened while we were transporting me from a holding cell to a detention center outside Boston. Without going into detail, let's just say my first attempt wasn't successful and I ended up badly concussed from a fall out of a transport van that required assistance of the highway patrol. I do not remember which detention center they sent me to, but I do remember which halfway house they sent me to as soon as a bed opened up, which was therapeutic center called 735 House in Wakefield, Massachusetts. It's closed now, but back in the day, it was a halfway house that provided intense therapy for juveniles. I spent about a year and a half, almost 2, and the relationships I developed there with the other kids and staff I will hold dear to my heart all my life. There were therapy sessions every day, all day, until it was time for sleep or we went on a field trip of some kind. We went on various field trips fairly regularly, such as whale watching, the zoo, museums, sailing, etc. I did escape from there around 4 or 5 times. 3 of those were with girls who were also in the halfway house because it was co-ed. They had me what they termed, quote, marathon groups, end quote, where we would have an all-day, all-night therapy session. The first time I ran away was with a girl named Sonia. The second time I ran away from this juvenile therapeutic halfway house was with a girl named Tammy, and the third time was with a girl named Julie. The others, I was alone. Every escape has a unique story, but I would eventually get caught again running streets, getting locked up for a while, and they would notify the halfway house that had me in custody, and the halfway house director would come pick me up and take me back to the 735 house. The very last time I ran away, I ran to a woman's house who used to be a staff member at the halfway house with Julie. Neil came directly to her house and tried taking us back to 735 house with a van and everyone in it, and I couldn't remember their faces pressed to the van windows, waiting expectantly. And with regret, Julie left with Neil and I stubbornly stayed. I was about 14 or 15, but I looked about 18 or 20. What I did not know was that Michelle, the former staff member whose house we ran to, liked me in a sexual way, so showing up at her door with a girl from a halfway house wasn't a bright idea. She had given me her address so that I would come see her alone. I eventually left Michelle's home and was rearrested in and while in detention center, Neil came to see me and asked if I wanted to return to 735 house, and I declined. And so began the next phase of my life, of which I would know nothing until a few months later, where they shipped me off to another halfway house called Andromeda House in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which was close to Harvard University. While at Andromeda, I worked at the Harvard cafeteria for their graduate students. I didn't smoke any weed while at 735 House, but I smoked a ton of weed when I got to Andromeda House, and it wasn't therapeutic. And I had friends there that I had been locked up with. In comparison to 735 House, which every day was tightly structured, Andromeda had no such daily routine other than they demanded we either go to school or get a job. Long story short, I was kicked out of the halfway house as well due to a fight that I did not participate in, but It was their belief that I had instigated the fight between two boys. Another lengthy story, unfortunately. Needless to say, I was returned to lockup until a bed opened in another halfway house. The last halfway house I was sent to was called Amber's house. Same rules as the previous one. I kind of cruised through that one, mostly uneventful, and when I turned 18, they released me. The one thing I remember from the last halfway house was when the Boston schools came out to give us some exams before we turned 18, and I had scored really well in everything but math. And they offered me a place at a junior college where I would live as a resident until they placed me in a college, and provided I applied there myself. And of course, because I didn't have a lot of common sense, I declined the offer. I had an opportunity to go to a junior college, which would have given me food, shelter, and have propelled me into a good college. I can't say that I didn't have opportunities to get on a productive track. From kindergarten up until 7th grade, again, I went to Catholic private school, and the only thing about going to private school is that everyone there knew you. But I did hear the principal, that was a bishop at our church, had been charged with the counts of sexual abuse of children about 10 years ago or so. I don't know what happened to him, though. I aged out of the system at 18, and they informed me that I had to leave. Their responsibility had been concluded, and at that moment I had nowhere to go. No money, no job, no prospects. I had been hoping that a man who had become a mentor to me would offer me a place to live with him, his wife, and 2 daughters, but that offer never came. I met my mentor, Richard Wallace, at Andromeda House because he was a counselor there, and we were tight. He was a Vietnam veteran, and he told me many stories and taught me a lot. Though he did not offer me a place in his house, he did purchase me a bus ticket to Washington, D.C., where my mother had relocated to. On the bus ride to D.C., there was a layover where a woman and I ended up exchanging numbers, and she contacted me the next day and brought over to my mother's apartment and brought over an eighth of a kilo of crack cocaine. But at the time in 1988, I did not know what crack was because it was the beginning of the crack era. I had been in the system, and so I had no experience with it in any shape, form, or fashion. How that turned out is a story for another time. My mother and I did not get along. Bear in mind that I had no trade work experience and I could not fill out an application because I didn't know how. Being unemployed created friction, so she enrolled me in the Job Corps in Pennsylvania. I may have neglected to tell you that during the entire time that I was in the DYs, my mother did not purchase me clothes or shoes while she traveled the world. Literally. I took clothes and shoes to wear from other kids. She never sent me money, but one time when she came to visit me with a husband she had now divorced for some years earlier, she brought me a bowl of African red rice and a dress shirt that was too small and tight. It didn't go with the sweatpants and sneakers I had stolen from another kid. During the entire 6 years I was in the DUIs, my mother visited twice. I hated when she popped up for those visits because it hurt so badly to see her go. So living with my mother after all these years apart didn't go so well as you can imagine. My then girlfriend and I got an apartment together. We subleased it from her aunt. That place was roach infested because she had been using it as storage, but I assume it may have been infested when her aunt lived there. We bombed every room, which was short-lived. Someone suggested boric acid and sugar mixed together. We did that, and we no longer saw any more roaches. We lived together for almost 3 years until she shot me in the chest. Yes, I almost died. The bullet missed my heart by 2 inches, nicked a major artery, collapsed my lung, broke some ribs, and came to rest next to my spine. You see, I was a cheater, and that drove her crazy for sure. One morning, after being out all night, I jumped in the tub and she comes in, enraged, hitting me across the face with a towel twisted into a rat tail. I got out and started packing my clothes, and she grabbed my gun, pointing it at me. When I tried to take it from her, she shot me. I declined pressing charges against her, and would have gone back to her had it not been for my mother. I had to recuperate at my mother's house for 2 weeks after being in the hospital with no insurance. They treated me for free essentially because I had lost a really good job that same week. The rent on our apartment previously was $600 per month, and we had paid for 4 months in advance. During those years in DC, a lot happened, and for the sake of time and skipping over tons, I was arrested once for burglary and given probation that would be deferred if I completed 180 hours of community service, which I completed at a men's shelter feeding people there. That's another long story, but during that time in my life, I kept regular jobs, and any crimes I committed were crimes of opportunity for money. After recovery, my mom put me on a bus or train to Cleveland, Ohio, where my father was. I'm 21 years old at this point. And now this is the end of his letters. You see, Quisi Bryan was scheduled with an execution date in January of 2026 when we were talking, and his focus started to shift towards his appeal and other necessary paperwork for legal reasons to change his date or to get his sentencing changed. In June of 2025, it was in fact rescheduled to November 15th, 2028. Though Governor DeWine stated the reason was, quote, due to the ongoing problems involving the willingness of pharmaceutical suppliers to provide drugs to the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction, DRC, pursuant to DRC protocol, without endangering other Ohioans, end quote. So let's get back to what we do know about Bryan, but for the rest of this, it's going to be based on facts and not necessarily the story that he's telling. So some of the dates might get a bit confusing because while crimes occur in a linear fashion, Bryan doesn't get convicted for many of these until later on, after he's already convicted for what he is for death row. So, after moving to Cleveland, Bryan didn't suddenly transform into a law-abiding citizen. Instead, it seems a downward spiral continues. What we do know based on convictions is that on March 15, 1994, Bryan kidnapped and raped a woman. The victim testified at trial that Bryan led her at knife point behind a vacant home on East 93rd Street in Cleveland into an abandoned car and raped her twice. She stated that Bryan threatened to kill her if she did not cooperate. Though he wouldn't be convicted until 2014 when the rape kit was tested and confirmed to match Bryan's DNA. Then, Judge David Mattia sentenced Bryan to a maximum of 50 years in prison. Additionally, in 2007, Bryan pled guilty to several other sexual assaults that happened prior to 2000, and this is again when he was sentenced up to 48 years in prison. In April of 2017, his sentence was reduced to 22 years in prison for the assaults after the Ohio Supreme Court ruled that judges in 5 Cuyahoga County rape cases wrongfully applied sentences to the law at the time the crime occurred. In 1995, Bryan attempts armed robbery, and he does get convicted, though I can't find what his sentence was. But still in 2000, he is on parole for this. And then on June 25th, 2000, Officer Leone pulled over Bryan at a gas station for a traffic violation in the central neighborhood of Cleveland, Ohio, at East 40th Street and Community College Boulevard. Cleveland police said Bryan was a suspect in a prior shooting. Bryan exited his vehicle as Officer Leone was approaching, and while Leone turned his head to communicate over his police radio, Bryan retrieved either a 38 or a 40, depending on sources. There's even a 45 named, so I'm not sure. It is a handgun of some sort that he had concealed in his coat, and he fired a shot directly at Leone from close range, striking him in the side of the face. The bullet lodged in Leone's spinal cord, causing immediate paralysis and rendering him unresponsive on the pavement. The shooting took place without Leone drawing his weapon or issuing commands. After shooting Officer Leone, Bryan took the officer's weapon and badge and fled the scene in his vehicle. As he drove away, Bryan also fired multiple shots at David Neidenhammer. He was a motorist who had witnessed the murder from a nearby red light. Though David was not struck, and he ended up surviving, and he provided a description of the shooter and vehicle, and he also testified at trial later on. Responding officers arrived minutes later. Physical evidence recovered immediately included the shell casings from the gun, matching Bryan's handgun, Leone's radio transmission log documenting the stop initiation, and blood spatter consistent with the execution-style shooting. According to Grokopedia, quote, ballistic analysis later linked the casings and projectiles to the weapon Bryan discarded during his flight, while Neidenhammer's eyewitness account corroborated the sequence, identifying Bryan as the perpetrator who shot Leone to evade arrest on outstanding warrants. No forensic evidence contraindicated the direct observations in the absence of defensive wounds on Leone's supported the determination of an unprovoked ambush, end quote. Bryan, as he left, ended up crashing his vehicle and fled on foot. Still, he wasn't apprehended until later that day when he was approximately 140 miles away in Columbus, Ohio. He was seen riding as a passenger, and they don't label who the driver is, in a Dodge Spirit, and was spotted by Columbus Police Sergeant Tyrone Hollis, who arrested him without incident. He saw him and noted the bolo that was out for him, and based on the description is how we get this arrest. The trial itself begins on October 22nd, 2000, presided over by Judge Timothy McGinty. For his crime, the jury unanimously found Bryan guilty of murdering Leon on November 9th. During sentencing, about a month later on December 1st, Bryan was subsequently sentenced to death plus 33 and a half years. In 2015, federal public defenders Lori Riga and Alan Rossman represented Bryan on an appeal to the United States District Court for the Northern District of Ohio. Judge James G. Carr overturned Bryan's case because prosecutors improperly tried to remove a prospective black juror from Bryan's trial simply because of her race. The United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit reversed Carr's decision 2-1 in December of 2016, ruling that the Toledo federal judge, quote, improperly substituted its interpretation of the evidence for the findings of the trial judge, end quote. The United States Supreme Court declined to hear the challenge to the Sixth Circuit's decision. Bryan was scheduled to be executed on October 26, 2022 at Southern Ohio Correctional Facility. On June 24, 2022, Bryan's execution was delayed to January 7, 2026. On June 20th of 2025, his execution was once again delayed to November 15th of 2028. At this time, he remains on death row in Ohio. Leon's murder was a catalyst for the creation of U.S. Marshals Northern Ohio Violent Fugitive Task Force, which recently made its 60,000th arrest. According to their website, quote, a collaborative district-wide law enforcement effort spearheaded by the U.S. Marshal Service that is dedicated to the pursuit, apprehension, and successful prosecution of violent adult fugitives across the Northern District of Ohio with outstanding state and federal felony warrants. This task force was formed in direct support of Project Safe Neighborhoods to join the nationwide commitment to reduce gun crime in America by networking existing local programs that target gun crime and providing those programs with additional tools necessary to be successful. Our effectiveness is based on the ability of federal, state, and local agencies to cooperate in a unified offensive. End quote. So, while it's a little solace to the family of Leon, there was something put in place to try and apprehend those that are more violent and those have a history in a safer manner. And for now, that's all on Quisi Bryan, though I'm sure his story isn't finished considering we do have an upcoming execution date, though it is 2 years in the future. So for all those out there listening, be careful. It's a dangerous world we live in.